Let's go back to those turbulent times when MMA was just gaining momentum. There was everything from underground battles to large arenas, where everyone wanted to prove that they were the coolest. The rules were almost invented on the spot, based on bloody experience. Back then, it was normal to set up rather freaky pairs, where a lightweight wrestler could fight against a real sumo wrestler. It was more of a show than a sport as we know it now. It wasn't always like that, and from time to time there were fighters who showed a completely different level. They tore their opponents to pieces. Ladies and gentlemen, let's remember today's great fights with Dan Severn. Yes, that's right, the guy who had the strength of a bull and didn't know what it was like to give up. He knew how to kick ass in a way that would make you want to tell your grandchildren about it. On this channel, it's going to be hot. Here we go. I propose to start with Severn's first appearance in the UFC. Don Fry would appear in the octagon only a couple of years later. So the title of the main mustache of mixed martial arts at that time was quietly taken by the Beast. The first opponent for Dan was Anthony Mad Dog Macias, for whom it was also his debut. The fighters were charged to win, but as it often happens, if a fighter sets his own pace and dictates the rules, it's only a matter of time before you want to knock on the floor and go home and drink tea. Macias had some advantages going in. He's a pretty capable Muay Thai fighter who was lucky enough to make his debut in his home state of Oklahoma. Did it help him in any way? No, it didn't. His entire fighting style boiled down to unsuccessful attempts to get out of the Beast's grasp. It was more like a father forcing his young son to eat vegetables, and if he refused, he just threw him from side to side. Dan Severn is clearly not the first to showcase his impressive wrestling skills against fighters of a different style, but it's not even a question of wrestling being stronger than boxing in any of its manifestations. It's just that Severn himself is super powerful in his style. The opponent simply wasn't ready to be denied at least something. Severn didn't hesitate, finishing the fight with a submission by rear naked choke in just a minute and 45 seconds of the first round. He used his superior strength and technique to land several impressive suplexes, each of which left the audience breathless. But Mad Dog realized with each landing that he was no longer needed. Full advantage and a loud start. Nowadays, it's commonly believed that wrestlers put on a boring show that makes you want to go to sleep. Back then, fighters like Dan Severn proved otherwise. You can and want to watch it over and over again. Looking ahead, I have to say that today we will mostly look at the early years of the UFC and the period when the biggest tops were there. This was the moment for Dan Severn when he fought with the best, and it was from 1994 to 1996. Wherever you look, you will find a real icon of that time. Royce Gracie, Ken Shamrock, Oleg Taktarov, and of course, our current killer. In the meantime, we have the Ultimate Tournament 1995, the beginning of the cage, and a fight between Severn and Paul Varelans. The fighters meet inside the octagon, and the bear shows that today he is just a bear cub. Look at this technique, how he fights. He's constantly on the move. He's constantly exhausting his opponent and not letting himself rest. He is constantly looking for the key that would put an end to the opponent. A very cool victory that makes the audience go crazy. They love this guy. His energy impresses them. The fight against Oleg Taktarov was supposed to be uncompromising, and it was. A couple of steps away from winning the UFC 5 tournament, the two decided to measure their wrestling skills to decide which country's style was more dominant. Will it be wrestling or sambo? Let's take a look and see. The fight was again completely dominated by the hero of this video. Severn successfully attacked and pressured that even Oleg, who was experienced in his fighting style, was forced to defend himself, first on his feet, but not for long, and then on the ground. Severn gradually lowered the Russian lower and lower. I must say that Taktarov was technically doing everything right. The open guard standard allowed him to minimize the pressure on his body and look for ways to take a dominant position, even though he was on his back. He was only unlucky in that Dan found a solution. He began to hit his opponent on the head regularly and methodically. He used both his fists and his knees. He was applying pressure, trying to get past the guard. The Russian bear was hoping for an armbar, but it was not to be. Dan continued to hit with knees, which led to serious cuts on Takhtarov's space. The referee stopped the fight, and the American went on to the final. There was nothing to be surprised about. That night, Severn was more aggressive in his actions than any of his opponents and would later take the title of the night. A real classic, the fight against Ken Shamrock. They were the complete opposite as people, Mr. Discipline versus the scandalous one. They didn't have much in common, except that they were both strong men ready to fight in a gachimuchi. A difficult fight. Shamrock, who was used to American football and professional wrestling, was considered more adaptable to different styles. It was not just a clash of physical strength, but a battle of different schools and approaches to combat. The world's most dangerous man entered the ring determined only to win. His strategy was not only to use his best techniques, but also to impose psychological pressure on Severn, trying to force him to make a mistake. The key moment of the fight came in the first round, and quite quickly. Shamrock, using Severn's momentum of failure, managed to apply a guillotine choke. One of his signature moves, the Beast, despite his attempts to escape, was forced to surrender. And this is a telling moment that even such professionals can be outplayed on their field. Ken didn't even have to use his fists and fight in a stand-up position, and Dan never found his advantage. He is used to dominating from the first minutes, making successful attempts to shift the emphasis to the ground and debunk the enemy there. But in this fight, he failed to be the one to set the pace. He gave up at the beginning of the third minute. After the fight, despite all the competition and tension that had been between them before, Shamrock approached Severn to thank him for the fight. It was unusual, but nice to see. We had to wait for their rematch. It was bound to happen. The year before, Dan Severn met His Majesty, the king of the street style, Tank Abbott. These two had to meet, at least for the sake of such a visual contrast between them. It was once again a fight between a basic wrestler and a chopper. Tank, known for his uncontrollable aggression and street fighting style, was ready to show that power and strength can outperform any technique. His approach to the fight was simple: go forward and hit, not counting the opponent's blows. On the other hand, the Beast, a wrestling master, was preparing to use his skills to neutralize Abbott's strength and prove that technique and strategy will always outweigh reckless power. It can be characterized as a battle of emotions against reason, and we know various examples when one side or the other wins. But what happened that night? Friends, before we continue, we want to thank you for watching and for any activity you do to spread our content. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. In the comments, be sure to share who your favorite fighter from that era of the UFC is and why. With that, we're moving on. From the very beginning of the fight, it became clear that Severn was not going to play by Abbott's rules. He used his wrestling skills to control his opponent's movements, constantly finding moments for punches and holds that not only impacted Tank, but also exhausted him. We have to give Abbott credit for holding out for a really long time. At one point while watching, it seemed as if he was going to win. His defense was too effective and complicated for active action. Sometimes Dan looked confused because he didn't know how to approach the lying down big man. However, the timer played in Severn's favor. Time expired, and the winner was obvious. The one who had been on top during the entire match. It was clear from the noise in the room and the reactions to any of Abbott's actions that all their love was for the underdog. They wanted this fat man to defeat a fighter who was too good to be true, like Dan Severn. However, it was not to be, and our hero once again showed his ability to play as the number one. An interesting fight took place at the final of the first UFC tournament, where Dan made his debut. We've already analyzed one fight from that day at the very beginning, and now we're looking at UFC 4's final and a meeting with Royce Gracie. By this evening, the Gracie dynasty had already been heard of, but their approach to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had not yet gained enough popularity to be called a separate movement. Severn dominated the early part of the fight, using his strength, mass, and wrestling skills to control Gracie. He seemed like an invincible giant, able to easily overpower anyone with his physical pressure and wrestling technique. That's how we first recognized him and saw a great chance of victory. For years afterwards, he would dominate in this style and achieve greatness by calmly outplaying his opponents. However, Gracie, despite Severn's apparent advantage in strength and size, used his unique BJJ skills to even the odds. He remained patient, waiting for his moment until he found an opportunity to apply a submission. The triangle he executed was logical, but completely unexpected. He withstood, in fact, 16 minutes of one-sided struggle to force the already tired Severn to surrender. It was a clear indication that technique and strategy can outweigh strength and aggression, and the Beast will use this lesson to the fullest. Because in his very long career, which was more than 120 fights, he lost only 19 of them, winning 101 times. He found a balance between perseverance, strength, and thoughtful fighting. This is what our final fight will be about. The revenge that the Russian dreamed of, a fight that lasted a full half hour, where at the end, one of the fighters looked like he had been through a war and he hadn't slept all the time. The 1995 Ultimate Tournament. We had already watched 2 preliminary fights from there, and it was time for the grand finale. This meant half an hour of continuous testing for both fighters. The middle of the fight, and especially the 15th minute, was the moment when the fight went down the path of an exhausting battle. It was clearly not the day when Ole could show us his best form. Their second match was even somewhat similar to the first. Very confident wrestling and constant attempts to make a painful grip. Sometimes they even met in a stand-up, but it didn't last long. Dan made any chance of defeating him impossible. He knocked all hope of winning the final out of the Russian's mind. There was a pause in the 15th minute, and only Bear needed this pause. This is confirmed by the way they both look at the end, squeezed like a lemon, Tektarov, and charged for at least a couple more Severn fights. That's who he is. Maybe it's talent or innate ability. Maybe it's fruitful work on himself. In any case, Dan Severn was in his place. This evening, in this octagon, in front of these spectators, he was where he was supposed to be, and he proved that he was the best. Friends, if you have viewed this far, thank you very much for your interest. We try to make our content of high quality and to make you want to stay with us. Be sure to subscribe, like, and leave a comment about today's hero. Be healthy and see you soon.